As you enjoy beekeeping this season, remember to look out for American Foulbrood and use best management practices to reduce the chances of your bees getting infected. What is American Foulbrood? American Foulbrood is a brood disease caused by the bacteria Paenibacillus larvae. A colony gets infected when young larvae consume American Foulbrood spores. And actually, the most susceptible larvae are those that are less than a day old. Once a spore is inside the body, it becomes vegetative and it starts replicating in the larva's midgut. Over several days, the bacteria continues to multiply, feeding off the larva. Eventually, the brood dies. This happens after the cell is capped, so it's usually at the prepupal stage, but sometimes it can happen at the pupal stage too. The brood changes in appearance. It becomes brown in color and mucus-like in texture, and it appears melted down, lying flat on the bottom of the cell. The infection spreads within a colony by nurse bees. Nurse bees may feed an infected larva and then feed a healthy larva, transferring the spores into their brood food. Also, bees will attempt to clean up the infection with their mouth parts. Here we see a group of bees cleaning up infected mucus-like brood. These bees may then feed healthy brood shortly afterward. So within weeks and months, a lot of brood in the colony can become infected. Ultimately, a colony dies from this infection. The population dwindles because with all that dead brood, there's not going to be enough healthy emerging bees to replace that older population. Having dwindling or dead colonies sitting in an apiary can pose a risk to other colonies nearby. Colonies within a several-mile radius might rob this undefended hive for its honey stores and bring those spores back to their own colonies. So what's the big deal? American Foulbrood is a very infectious disease because it spreads easily within a colony and between colonies. It's also considered the most destructive of bee diseases, not only because it kills colonies that it infects, but because in a lot of places, including New York State, in order to eliminate this infection, colonies must be destroyed. So in New York State, all colonies that have American Foulbrood must be eliminated, usually through burning. It's also the law to report all cases of American Foulbrood to the Department of Agriculture and Markets because they carefully track the incidence each year and the spread. Destroying infected colonies and contaminated combs is the only way to effectively eliminate the disease. Why? Because American Foulbrood reproduces through very resilient spores. These spores are not killed by very hot temperatures or very cold temperatures or even antibiotics. They are invisible to the naked eye but can linger on things like comb or woodenware, bee bread, or even honey. And in addition to being hard to kill, these spores can also remain viable and capable of infecting larvae for many decades. They can last a very, very long time on contaminated equipment. So it can be a pretty tricky disease to manage. And actually, there was a time in New York State's history when American Foulbrood was quite prevalent. But now, thanks to the keen eye of beekeepers and our state inspection program with inspectors also looking for the disease and eliminating colonies that are infected, we now have an annual incidence of less than 2%. So the system that seems to be working so far is to really encourage folks to look for American Foulbrood and to have state inspectors also actively looking for American Foulbrood. Then when we have cases, those colonies are essentially in quarantine, meaning they can't leave an apiary until they're able to be destroyed. Inspectors assist beekeepers in destroying those colonies and provide additional guidance if any further action is needed. So it's great that American Foulbrood is now an uncommon disease, but because it's now uncommon, many beekeepers have never seen American Foulbrood before, so they might not recognize it in their own hives. There's also a misconception that AFB is a historical disease that no longer exists, and this is not true. American Foulbrood is still around. We still find cases every single year. And it can be found anywhere in New York State, and it can impact colonies of all operation sizes, whether you're a hobbyist with only one hive or a commercial beekeeper with hundreds or thousands of colonies. As with all honeybee diseases, the health of your bees can impact the health of other bees. With honeybees traveling several miles from their hive in search of food, and with their tendency to drift into nearby hives or rob weak colonies, a scenario can occur where an AFB infection in one colony can spread to many others. So all beekeepers need to be familiar with diagnosing AFB and know what to do if they find it. Luckily, American Foulbrood has very distinguishing symptoms, which makes it fairly easy to diagnose in the field. The main symptom of American foulbrood is seeing brown, melted brood lying on the floor of their cells. The brood, which is normally white, becomes beige, as seen in this photo, and then eventually it develops this distinct coffee color, like coffee with milk in it. This dead brood does not resemble a prepupa at all. It appears melted and is lying flat in the cell. If you poke it with a toothpick, the larva is mucus-like in texture, and usually if you pull the toothpick out, the larva will form a stringy rope. Over time, the infected larvae start to dry up, and as it dries up, it no longer forms this rope when you put a toothpick into it. Eventually, the brood becomes a hard, black scale that adheres to the floor of the cell. And in this image, I've pulled back the sides of the cell so that you can more easily see that black scale. With brood dying and lying flat in their cells, and with them drying up into a small scale on the floor of the cells, it's common to see a spotty brood pattern. Also, in an attempt to clear the infection, some bees inside the colony will remove the infected brood, and this also contributes to a spotty pattern. So the first thing you might notice as a beekeeper is the spotty pattern, and then upon looking closer, you may see the brown melted brood. That flat brown brood at the floor of the cell is the most obvious symptom of this disease. But there are a couple other symptoms that you might see too. For instance, you'll likely also see perforated cappings. Because the brood dies after the cell has been capped, the dead brood is going to be inside the cells that are covered over with wax cappings. But bees can usually detect that the brood inside the cell is dead or sick, and they chew irregular holes in the cappings. If you look into these holes, you can see melted brood. With that mucus-like brood inside the cell, you may also see that the cappings are sunken, or you might also see some wet brown mucus oozing out of the cells. Remember, healthy capped brood cappings are dry and are either flat or slightly concave. They're not sunken, they don't have holes, and they're not oozing anything. As I mentioned, some of the brood may die in the pupal stage. These dead pupae also turn that characteristic brown color and melt down against the floor of the cell. A very characteristic symptom of pupae that die from AFB is that you can see their tongue sticking out. Here are some infected pupae. I've peeled back the sides of the cells so that you can see easier. Their cell cappings have been chewed off by the bees. Notice their brown color and notice how melted the one on the far right appears. So let's practice looking for symptoms of disease on this frame. So right off the bat, we notice the spotty brood pattern, right? Let's take a closer look into some of those open cells. Can you see that some of those openings actually contain infected brood? See how many of those cells you can find that have infected brood in them. This isn't really obvious right away, is it? But as you look closer, you'll notice that many of the cells have dead brood in them, and you might also start to notice cells with some perforated cappings. And in some of those perforated cells, there's also dead brood. The scale is also visible, and that's a great symptom to look for too. Scale appears black and is adhered to the floor of the cell. You can't pick it out with a hive tool or a toothpick. The wax of the cell just comes out with it. This scale contains many spores, and so frames from infected colonies are very risky to keep, and they must either be burned or irradiated. If you give a frame with scale to a healthy colony, the healthy colony is likely to develop an infection. Sometimes a colony dies from American foulbrood and the beekeeper doesn't realize this, and they may reuse those frames or sell them to other beekeepers and inadvertently spread the disease. Scale is hard to see, especially if the comb is old and dark, so you need to use light to your advantage. Use sunlight or a flashlight in order to see the scale. So here we're looking down onto the frame so that we can see the floor of the cells. So the first step toward being in control of AFB is being able to recognize these symptoms. We recommend beekeepers inspect their colonies for AFB 3 times during the year. This means going through every brood frame in a hive at 3 different time points. Typically, people choose to do this in spring before adding supers, in late summer after removing honey supers, and again before you winterize the colony. These are natural time points when beekeepers are typically taking stock of the condition and health of the colony anyways. When inspecting a colony for American foulbrood, we want to check through every single frame of brood in the brood nest to look for the disease. Let's just go through a couple of frames right now so I can show you my process for looking for it. Okay, so here's a frame of brood. First, I'm just going to check to see if the queen is on here. And she is not. Okay. So here we have a frame of brood. What we're going to be doing with our eyes is actually looking through the bees into the brood. And right now this frame isn't too covered with bees, so I can still get a good look at the brood on the frame. If you have a lot of bees on this frame, don't be afraid to shake them into the hive so that you have a nice clean view of the brood. To get a closer look at the brood, you can gently tap the bees and they will move out of the way for you. So the first thing that my eye is looking for when I'm looking at a frame of brood is to look at the capped brood and see if there's a spotty pattern. See if there are holes in there where we don't have brood. And this actually does have a little bit of a spotty pattern. You can see there are several cells here that are empty. So my eye is going to look in those cells and see if we're seeing any dead, melted brood lying flat on that cells that's brown in color. So I'm going to very carefully look through all of these holes for that symptom. And when you're holding the frame, if it's a sunny day, you want to make sure that the sun is shining directly into those cells so that you have the benefit of having the cell illuminated so you can really get a good look as to what's going on in there. If it's not a sunny day, you can carry a mini flashlight with you. The next thing that I'm going to be looking at is if there are any issues with the cappings themselves. So with American Foulbrood, we can see sometimes the cappings are concave, sometimes they are a little moist where we can see some of that brown, mucousy, dead brood sort of spilling out of it. And sometimes we're just seeing perforations in the capping. So here's an example of a cell that I notice right now that has a perforation in it. And I can look through that. The perforation is large enough that I can see the brood beneath it is white. And to me, that looks like it's either a prepupa or a pupa. The bees have certainly opened this cell. They're not just closing that cell, but it's not because of American Foulbrood. If it were American Foulbrood, I would see that melted brood underneath, that kind of pre-pupa that's lying flat in its cell or has its tongue sticking out and is brown in color. If I'm not sure, I can actually use a toothpick and open this up to get a better look. So let's do that. Okay, so this was just a pre-pupa like I thought it might be. This does not look like American Foulbrood. Let's take a look at some other perforations that we saw. Okay, here's my next one. That's much of the same. And we have this cell here too. And that's the exact same thing. So I can also see another issue in this cell here. I can see that there's some dead brood in there, and it's actually just a piece of brood. We would consider this to be some brood that bees have partially consumed, so they were in the process of removing it. I'm not worried about this as far as American Foulbrood because the color is white, and if I were to pick this brood out, you'll notice that it's not ropey at all. It just comes out in one chunk. So far I have seen some issues with this brood. The pattern is a little spotty. We are seeing that the bees are chewing off or causing perforations in some of the cappings. And at least this one brood that we've seen here is partially cannibalized, or we call this chewed down brood. But these symptoms are not from American Foulbrood. These are actually more in line with what we would expect to see when varroa mite levels are creeping up. Let's take a look at the other side of this frame. All right, so we're seeing a similar thing on this side of the frame. I am seeing that some of this brood is spotty, so kind of systematically I want to be looking through these holes for any cells that have been chewed or for any brood that appears melted and brown in color. If the bees are in my way, I'm going to gently move them out of the way by tapping them. And so there are a couple cells that my eye is being drawn to here. It's the same situation as we saw on the other side of this frame. The cells are perforated, but I can clearly see that this is not brood that's melted or brown. And if I were to pull that out with my toothpick, I would notice that it's not ropey at all. So I want to continue doing this with all of the frames of brood in the hive. The next thing I'm going to show you how to look for is scale. And we can look for scale in our actual colonies, in the combs that are inside of our hives, and we can also look for scale in any stored combs. So when I'm looking for scale, the way that I hold the frame to look for it is like this. I want to be able to hold the frame at an angle so that I can see what is lying at the bottom of the cells. And I, again, scan my eyes sort of systematically through these cells to see if there's any noticeable black scale lying at the bottom of those cells. What do you do if you see symptoms of American Foulbrood? If you see symptoms of this disease, it's important to do two things. The first is to test the infection, and the second is to report the infection to the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. By law, all cases of American Foulbrood must be reported in New York State. It's really important for beekeepers to test their colonies for American Foulbrood so that you can actually verify that that's the disease that you're seeing. And beekeepers can do a really quick 2-minute test in their own apiary using something called a Vita AFB test kit. And I recommend keeping a couple of these on hand at all times, just in case you find yourself in this situation. In order to do this test, just follow the instructions on the label. It typically requires scooping up several of this infected brood and putting it into a container with solution. And I'll say that it is tricky to scoop up some of this brood because it is so mucousy, so just try your best to get several samples of that into that container. You then shake the contents of the container and put a couple droplets of the solution onto a test kit. And within a minute or so, you'll be able to see if the test is positive or if it's negative. It's negative if there's just one line for the control line, and it's positive if you have 2 lines, a control line and a test line. And my advice to give folks is to look very carefully for the test line. Often with American Foulbrood, the line that appears is very faint, but even if it's faint, that is a positive detection. Another way to test for American Foulbrood is to send a sample to the USDA Beltsville Bee Lab. And this lab actually processes your sample for free, but it does take a couple of weeks to get back. And I would say even if you're doing a Vita test kit in the field, it's also a great idea to send in a sample to the Beltsville lab because they can test that bacteria for antibiotic resistance. And that's something important that the state keeps track of. To send in a sample, you can cut out a piece of comb that contains a lot of infected brood. You can wrap it either in a paper towel or a paper bag, and you can mail it to the Beltsville Bee Lab. You can also mail a sample of the probe, like a Q-tip or toothpick, that has this mucousy infected brood on it. Joan Mahoney is New York State apiculturist, and she is the person to call if you have a suspected or confirmed case of American Foulbrood. Her contact information is listed here if you need to call her or email her. And when you do, she's going to arrange to have an inspector come and visit your operation. The inspector is going to inspect the colony that has American Foulbrood, and he or she will inspect all other colonies in that yard. Inspectors will also attempt to look at colonies within a 2-mile radius of the affected apiary to try to determine the extent of the spread. And inspectors must be present when the colony is destroyed. So that means they're present when the colony is being burned or buried in places where burning isn't permitted so that they can ensure that it's being done properly. Some beekeepers must be inspected for American Foulbrood. In an effort to identify and control the spread of American Foulbrood, State inspectors spend considerable time and effort looking for this disease in hives, and you might need to reach out to an inspector and receive inspections if you're in one of two categories. The first category is if you're a beekeeper looking to sell nukes, queens, or equipment. In that case, you must schedule an appointment to have your colonies inspected, and you must receive a certificate of apiary inspection before you can sell these things. The second is if you're hoping to move your colonies out of New York State. Whether you're doing contract pollination or are moving your colonies to winter in a warmer state, you also need to be inspected before you can move these colonies and receive a certification showing that you're free of American Foulbrood. If you fall into one of these two categories, you can contact Joan Mahoney to arrange a time to get inspected. So now that we know what American Foulbrood looks like and we know what to do if we find it, what are some steps we can take to try to prevent this infection developing in our colonies? We have 11 practices here that we encourage you to incorporate into your own routine. 1. Inspect colonies for AFB 3 times a year: spring, right after removing the honey crop, and prior to overwintering. Become familiar with how to recognize this disease so that you can detect it in your hives before it's become too widespread. 2. Do not purchase bees or equipment from companies or beekeepers that do not have an inspection certificate. 3. We recommend that you don't purchase or use someone else's old equipment and combs. When you acquire new equipment, it's safer to buy it new or build it yourself. 4. Take practices to reduce drifting and robbing in your own apiaries. Spread your colonies apart if you can, and paint them different colors to reduce drifting. Maintain strong colonies and use robbing screens during late summer dearths. Keep colonies open for short periods of time during dearths, and be careful not to spill syrup or honey in the yard. Do not leave comb or hive debris in the yard either. 5. Always do a thorough inspection of the brood nest before transferring equipment, frames, or bees among your hives. 6. Sterilize your hive tool and wash your hands in between visiting apiaries or working an infected colony. 7. Do not bring your gloves, hive tools, or other equipment to someone else's apiary. If you must, sterilize them thoroughly after the visit. 8. Cutouts can carry AFB. When acquiring bees of unknown origin, keep them isolated from other colonies for the time it takes for them to produce several cycles of brood. Monitor the colony regularly for symptoms. 9. When possible, order hygienic stock bees. Bees with this trait are good at identifying and removing infected brood. 10. Do not feed colonies honey purchased from the grocery store, as it can contain AFB spores. And 11. Replace combs once they reach 5 years of age. A good routine to get into is to replace the 2 oldest frames from each hive body every year. Spores can build up and remain in comb over time, so recycle out that old comb. When it comes to honeybee diseases, we're all in this together. The health of one beekeeper's bees can influence the health of other bees within a few miles, so we must work cooperatively to keep the incidence of American Foulbrood low. So look for this disease, test any symptoms that you're seeing, report cases, and destroy infected colonies with the oversight of an inspector. If you still have questions, feel free to explore the resources on Cornell's Pollinator Network, as well as the Department of Agriculture and Markets at these links.